Hi, Misha here, and lately on this channel we've had a lot of videos on modern guns, a lot of AKs, which is good. I think people enjoy them, we enjoy them, but let's slow things down a bit. I thought, why don't I record a few videos on milsurp guns, and for the past 6 months or so, Rob Ski, aka Operation Union, asked me to look for him a Finnish M39 Mosin-Nagant. And last week I happened to have one come in the shop. Asked him if he was still looking for one. He said yes, so shipped it out to him the other day. So that had me thinking about the good old M39, the gun that I have quite a bit of history with because I was introduced to it when I was quite young. Very interesting gun. This one up here I picked up from the importers when these were coming in. Oh, that was probably, I'm not sure, 2007 maybe, 2006. And this one down here, I actually stole out of my neighbor's front yard. I'm not kidding. Well, sort of. I'll explain eventually. That should intrigue you a bit. This one is a 1944 VKT, later known as Valmet, with a D-marked chamber. And this one is another 1944. This one, S for SAKO or SAKO. So the same year, two different makers. You'll notice a few differences, including the stock and the cleaning rod, and a few other things we'll talk about. So yeah, why don't we talk about some history, features, myths, just have fun, hang out, talk about the M39, because it is a very neat gun and one of the final variants in the Mosin lineage. Let's see how fast I can get through the history. So Finland fought a war against Russia for independence. Then you had the whites versus the reds there in 1918. And finally, in 1919, we had the foundation and security of a new nation, which set about having its own army, and separate from that, it had its own civil guard, initials CG. And the Mosin-Nagant would quickly become its de facto rifle. They had lots of leftover Mosins from the Imperial Russians, and they traded for even more Mosins because lots of people in Europe had them following World War I that did not need them. And Finland had some things like Mausers that it didn't want because it decided to standardize on 7.62 rimmed, the Russian round. Now Russia used 7.62 by 54R, which was about a .310 to .311 projectile bore. The Finns ultimately had their own version, known as 7.62 by 53, which used a nominal .308. Slight differences. In the beginning, they just took regular 1891 Mosins. Some of them they put into service just as is. Others they would rebuild, giving them stronger stocks, going to these wire type sling swivels on some, going to kind of a splice in the stock, and some would get heavier barrels. There's a whole thing. There's also a variant known as the 9124. The Army adopted this as the M91. The Civil Guard, again, would adopt a slightly different variant as the M9124. In the beginning, they were mostly just recycled parts. As they needed barrels, they would order them from various manufacturers in Europe. Eventually, they would tool up to make barrels and things like that for themselves. And that would lead to kind of this generation. The Civil Guard in the Army had their own separate guns. Here's the Army's. This is the M27. This is the long variant. And this is the Civil Guards. This is the M2830. a slight update to the initial M28, mostly to do with refined sights, nose cap, what have you. Now you'll notice these are slightly shorter than the original Mosin. That's because they went down to about a 26.5, some sources say 27-inch barrel with these. And they started making their own stocks, or splicing original and their own stocks together. Again, there's a whole thing. And they had a few other interesting features for guns like the M27. There were some little wings put on the bolt to guide it. This one has the so-called ski trooper swing swivels. Then you have guns like this that use the traditional slots. There's all kinds of varieties here. Good fun. The M27, as you see, uses a pretty standard Mosin rear sight. But the M2830 went to this pattern of rear sight. Of course, the Mosin has an unprotected front sight, cleaning rod, that style of front end, takes a socket bayonet, whereas both of these have a protected front sight and take a knife bayonet and have this style of front end. Notice this is hinged, and it has these popsicles to reinforce it in the back. This is not hinged, single piece up here. Yeah, so there were differences, one for the Army, one for the Civil Guard. And the M91 will start to be phased out of production in favor of the M27 and the M28 and later M2830. And of course, as old Russian parts wore out, they would need to either make their own or contract for their own. This would last up through the mid-30s, when the powers that be in Finland decided it was kind of getting ridiculous to have two separate rifle lines that were very similar, but not necessarily all that interchangeable. Why not just adopt a one-size-fits-all, especially considering the M27 had been giving some problems for the Army. So yeah, why don't we kind of combine the best features and come up with a standard? And I'm sure you can see what the issue is here. The Army and the Civil Guard disagreed. What the Army wanted and proposed, like I said, this is the M27, this is the long version. But they did have a version put into relatively low production known as the M27 KV or RV. It was a 20.5-inch barrel, so much like a Mosin carbine, and meant for cavalry. The Army liked this idea. They wanted to go to a carbine. So they thought, well, they'll do that. They'll make a few other changes to the M27, and this became the M35 prototype. The Civil Guard, on the other hand, they had already made some changes to the M28 to come up with the M2830, and pretty much felt like it was as good as it needed to be. Maybe a few changes could be adopted, but basically it's good. And they really liked having their 26.5-inch barrel. And they really enjoyed having their finely adjustable iron sights. So they were concerned with accuracy, shooting. They did not like the idea of the M35. They thought the short barrel would produce too much flash, too much concussion, too much noise, and just decrease accuracy overall. The Army, in turn, their complaints against the M2830 mostly had to do with durability. They just weren't convinced that it could hold up to the abuse that it would take it. They were kind of worried about that fancy rear sight, and they were not sure about how easy it would be to repair, replace parts, that kind of thing. So we have two different standards here, And so things kind of set at an impasse for several years. But finally, in April of 1939, essentially the Army agrees to adopt what is the Civil Guard's modified 2830. About the only thing they changed, the rear sight got a new close-range battle setting, and some of the hardware was changed out, and thus the M39 prototypes were born. Of course, some more changes would be introduced with the design, and we can really see where it borrows from both of these guns. Starting at the muzzle, the front sight really, we see this has the adjustment screw here on these. We notice it's a different style on the 27, so the 39 mostly uses a 2830 style. Now the barrel itself is the same length, but these, the 27 and the 2830, have slightly heavier barrel profiles than the 39. They shaved back the barrel just a bit, profile-wise, to save on resources and to save on weight for the poor soldier. And these all use cleaning rods. Slightly new style for the 29. They all take a blade bayonet. A new pattern was made for the 39, but it could use some of the older ones, and these are basically inspired by the puka. And the end cap is interesting, the nose cap. The 2830 is a solid piece that just is attached with a screw, and it's a split bridge on top. And the 27, we have these popsicles for reinforcement, and it's hinged here. There's a hinge on both sides, so it can easily be removed. It's also solid on top. For the 39, they went to a solid top with a hinge. There's this side hinge, and then there's, of course, this style on the other side here. So the end cap is very much inspired from the 27, just no popsicles. As far as the forearm, both the older guns have the slot in the bottom for the cleaning rod. The 39 is solid now. I mean, that makes perfect sense. We'll get to the other side in a minute. Upper hand guards. Looking at the rear sight, here's the 27. Very much a standard 91 sight, just slightly modified. And here is the 2830's rear sight. That was one of the changes from the original 28. And here is the 39's. You can definitely see that the rear sight takes after its Civil Guard parent, its side of the family, if you will. Now, all of these are built on original Russian hex receivers. That's one part that Finland never made themselves. They always use recycled Russian receivers. Although thankfully the Russians were kind enough to donate some round receivers to Finland during the Winter War and the Continuation War. Also, Finland would continue to use existing bolts from Russian guns, as well as magazine boxes and parts of the fire control group, the trigger assembly. Moving back here, there's some of the ski sling swivels and all that. This has the slots, this doesn't. This seems a good time to flip them over. Now, the point of these kind of side and ski swivels was so that different troops, especially ski troops, could use them. And of course, the Civil Guard guns had more traditional sling swivels, either the slots here or the wires like you saw in the 91. Well, since this was to be a one-size-fits-all gun, not just for the Army and Civil Guard, but also for mounted troops, ski troops, infantry troops, we have two sets of sling swivels, side and bottom on the front, little swivels here. And for the rear, we have a bottom swivel, and then an inlet in the stock, done so it wouldn't poke someone in the back. So dual sling swivels there. So I think you see kind of how the two are connected. Now, of course, with the M39, we have some just all new features too. The stock set, the handguard is thicker. The stock set has this semi-pistol grip. We have a new style of trigger internally from before. We went away from the kind of crazy winged bolt of the 27, thankfully. That one never worked well. So it was a combination of everything. So yeah, it was accepted for service. Prototyping was done in 1939, and when the Winter War began in November of 1939, there were all of 10 of these actually made. So it was not ready for the Winter War. So because of all the delays, the arguing between the two entities, it wasn't available, which actually meant that M27 and M2830 production would continue, and actually M91 production was started back up just to fill the gap of the war. Now, of course, there would be a treaty in March of 1940, but peace would not last long. By 1941, Russia and Finland were again at war. This time we're calling it the Continuation War, which would last up until 1944 and lead into the Lapland War. So lots of wars to talk about here, and the M39 is just starting to take off the ground. So now we're back to these. In 1940, the Army placed its first order for 20,000 with SAKO, and it started to receive the first M39s in 1941. At least was able to get them into the field and start using them. Of course, this order would be later upped to 40,000 and then some, and VKT would get involved. In fact, VKT production would be pretty much at the same time as SAKO, but VKT would only really make the barrels and receivers. Final assembly would actually be done at AV3, which was a government, an Army depot. But of course, this was also made for the Civil Guard. They would place an order for 20,500, but actually only 10,500 would be delivered before essentially the Civil Guard was dissolved. You would have some other things turn up. For example, barrels from Tikakoski would be used for some of these, and even some older barrel blanks from Belgium would be reprofiled to work with the M39. So it was definitely not just across the board identical. There were variants. In fact, the first SAKO guns, about 7,000, had straight stocks. They didn't have the swell for the pistol grip area yet. It took them a little time to get that running. And it took them time to get everything kind of in production because there was a lot of hardware that needed to be made here. All the barrel components, the sights, things of that nature. So it took time to get into production. And with that, it would become Finland's standard rifle for the Continuation War. In fact, SAKO and VKT, or AV3, would produce about 96,800 during the war, before the Winter War and the Continuation War period, I should say, was over in 1944. Afterwards, they would continue to assemble M39s from parts, some dated 1945, and the number would rise to about 102,000. Some sources say 120,000, but take it as you will. Post-war records from the late 40s, early 50s showed that the Army, which now kind of enveloped the National Guard, had roughly 78,000 in inventory. Of course, some were lost to combat, and some were put in kind of hidden caches throughout the country, just in case the Russians tried to pull anything again. So that was the gun, and it would remain in frontline service through the mid-60s, and really would not be phased out entirely through the 70s, and even some would be kept as shooting and DMR type guns for quite a while. This is why we didn't really see a lot of surplus M39s in America till the 90s and 2000s. So what is it? What makes this such a good Mosin? Why do people like it so much? And is it really that superior to the Russian? First off, things like the bolt were really, well, this one's stiff, of course. There we go. I need a clean Cosmoline out. Were quite smooth, well worked, well honed. And even though some of the trigger components were new and some were old, they were also reworked to deliver a much more consistent pull. The magazine, too, was updated to feed better. Now, to be fair, these were built from 91 magazine designs, which had used a different interrupter system than the later 9130. Let's try this one's bolt. I've had this one, like I said, quite a bit longer. Quite a nice, predictable trigger, and a very smooth, even bolt on these. And the ergonomics were certainly improved too. You have the semi-pistol grip, which is nice. You also have finger grooves, grasping grooves here. Very nice and deep. You have a much improved rear sight compared to the Russian. Again, we have a new battle setting for close-in shooting too. We have protective ears here. And we have high-quality barrels, no matter who made them. It's just they tend to be higher quality than what you would find on most of your Russian guns. Moving forward, we have a sturdy stock, double sling swivels. We have an easier to get to cleaning rod than the Mosin. We have a more effective bayonet lug. And again, we have a protected front sight that's adjustable. So overall, just a better design. And it's shorter than the 91 and also the 9130 at about 46.5 inches, whereas say a 9130 is about 48.5 inches. Although it is a little heavy because of the heavier barrel and the heavier, thicker stock. But overall, it really was a fit and polished gun. One thing to mention, this has a D mark over the chamber. That just means that it was able to fire Russian ball ammo. As I said at the beginning, the Finns had their own version, 7.62 by 53, with a nominal 308. When they went to the M39, they wanted a standard that could fire Finnish ammo or Russian ammo, and even either Russian light ball or Russian heavy ball at that. So they increased the bore to about 0.310 to 0.311, and they also slightly lengthened the cut for the chamber so that guns, really all M39 should be able to shoot Russian ammo just fine, although some of them, like this one, aren't necessarily marked with the D. That was a standard, but you know, different factories, different standards here. And you can find all kinds of interesting barrel markings and stock maker markings, not just straight versus pistol grip. There's all kinds of neat little variants. In fact, let's talk about a couple. You'll notice on these, this one has the cleaning rod in the white, and this one is blued, so that's the difference. From what I understand, the white was first, but I could be wrong on that. And of course, the most obvious difference is the stock. Original wartime stocks have this very nice finish on them. It's not pine tar, as some have claimed. That's a myth. And it's not linseed oil. It's kind of a beeswax, turpentine. It's a proprietary mix, really, that is unique to Finland. But it's a unique chemical mix. It's kind of a semi-gloss. Of course, these stocks often look more beat up because, well, wartime. But later produced guns, and guns that were reworked after World War II, have this style of stock, which many think is unfinished. Very matte color, very exposed grain, but that's not true. It does have a finish, kind of a sealer on it. Actually, a pretty effective one. Just flipping it over so you can see how rough hewn the swing swivel cut is. But this is finished wood, so you definitely don't want to go refinishing one of these if you get one, because this is correct and it does have a finish on it. It's just later production M39 stocks. You also can see the same thing with the KP-31 Suomi submachine gun stocks. Earlier ones have this style of finish, later ones, or replacement stocks, have this style. And again, you can really go into it. For example, the SA in the box, the property mark, some of them had the earlier style, which is a long phrase and finish. Some guns had the SA added later. As far as matching serial numbers, since these were put together, since all Finnish guns are basically kit guns, you're not going to have a lot of factory marked guns. Typically, you'll just have a remarked bolt that matches a receiver. The floor plate can either be unnumbered, scrubbed, or lined out, or occasionally it can be matched to the rest of the gun, but this doesn't seem to be often the case. And the same thing goes for over here, the butt plate. Either they're unnumbered, scrubbed out, lined out, or maybe E-matched. But don't expect stamped matching numbers on a fin. If your bolt and receiver match, which they needed to do for head spacing, you are good to go. That is what fin matching means. Just as a quick aside, the Finns also had what they called the M9130. The Russians were kind enough to donate about 25,000 9130s during the Winter War, and upwards of another 100,000 throughout the longer continuation war. On top of that, Nazi Germany donated over 50,000 captured Mosins, although many of them were in pretty piss-poor condition. So this is how you'll start to see round receiver Finnish guns. Now, if they were still usable, they would just essentially reissue them. But Tikakoski would be set to refurbish some of the 9130s, giving them Finnish style sling swivels, sometimes giving them a heavier stock, sometimes keeping the 9130 front sight, other times giving it a Finnish front sight. And it was even decided in 1943 to manufacture 9130 barrels. But they only would make about 15,000 barrels for these, and they would only start to redo them by the time the war was over. So there was only about 5,000 9130s in the Finnish army when the war ended. A few more would be put together after the war using the existing parts and barrels, but it's kind of a brief little aside. So the M39, while it was front line, the 9130 was used to kind of fill the gaps and also replace some older rifles, or rifles that the Finns didn't like, such as the Carcano M38 that they received from Italy. So even now, they still have a hodgepodge of guns. So it's probably a really good thing they kind of unified the Army and Civil Guard series. So what about my two guns, my personal level? Like I said, I was introduced to the M39 pretty early in my milsurp collecting. There was actually a professor friend that worked at the university that really liked these. It kind of got me into them. And they were always more than standard Russian Mosin, of course. And what's interesting is that, you know, these saw wear, they saw tear. You'll find honest bluing wear on them, but usually the bores are in perfectly good shape, and they're good shooters. And this was one of my I think this was probably my first one that I bought myself. Cost about $300 from the importer. You know, just ordered it in. And, you know, being SAKO marked is neat. And I know it's all correct because this came straight from the importer. It's a good example of a later production one from the end of the continuation war. And it is a good shooter. I have shot it. But I always wanted to have one with the more military style stock. And I thought it would be nice to have a VKT one because, as you know, I do own a Valmet AK and I own a Valmet Lottie. So having a Valmet, which is what VKT would become, gun would be neat. Plus, I think how they were assembled at the government depot is kind of a neat story too. And there are some minor differences. Well, this one came along. Person offered to trade me this for something, I forget what now. And he promptly mailed it off. And I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And, you know, like 3 weeks or whatever went by. And I emailed him, and he said, oh, it was delivered. And I said, no, it wasn't. And, of course, this was UPS, the company I have the best luck with in the world. We kind of called them up, and they said, oh, yeah, it was delivered. No, it wasn't. This was right around the holidays in December. Well, a little investigation determined that it was delivered to a neighbor's house. A signature was not obtained. It was not put in a garage or anything. It was literally just left out in their front yard. When we found it, it was just, the box was just laying in the front yard. Maybe they put it up against the house and it got blown over by something, but it was just laying in the front yard and had been there for a few days. Gotta love UPS. And of course, the address that was written on it was ours. They just took it to the wrong house and just left it there. I mean, I guess it's good. It didn't get stolen. I guess that means I live in a pretty decent neighborhood. And it hadn't been rained on. Of course, the box had some damage from dew, but the gun underneath was fine. So, yeah, lucky break that this didn't go missing into the ether. Which is why, if you ship a gun, you always need to put signature confirmation on it. And that way, if they don't get a signature, it is patently their fault, not yours. Because especially around the holidays and other busy seasons, drivers, let's just say, they're not always paying attention, and they're always in a hurry. But after that, I decided I'll hang on to it. It's a good example of VKT, and it's kind of neat that it's from the same year as the SAKO. Well, I haven't actually shot this one. This one's just kind of the one I always shoot. But they're just neat guns. They really are. And they hold a very special place in Finland, and they're really the last of the major Finnish Mosin variants, and a combination of work that they started with the M91. Of course, I know that there are some target variants and different things made after, and some different, you know, builds from parts. Sure, I know that. You know that. I know that. But you know what I mean. This was the last version. They produced over 100,000. It served for nearly 30 years frontline use, and is what Finland went to when they decided they no longer wanted the Russians coming over uninvited. Really neat guns if you haven't checked them out. So it is a Mosin mechanically, but it's just a Mosin in its best possible way. Done with a high quality barrel, with the bolt and trigger smoothed out, with a much more ergonomic buttstock, much better sights. So yeah, if you own one of these, what do you have? Any interesting variants or markings? Any experience with shooting? What kind of groups do you get? What is your gun like? Yeah, let's talk about the Finnish M39, the old man Pekka, as they called it when it was introduced, nicknamed after the president of Finland at the time. The Finns like giving nicknames to things. I appreciate you hanging out. I know mill syrup's not everyone's cup of tea, but it really is fun. And it's relaxing, I think. If you could, like, share, and subscribe. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to our Patreon page. And again, as I said at the beginning, I sent one of these to Rob Ski, so I'm sure he'll be doing some videos in the future on actual shooting and accuracy. You know, he's a trigger puller. So this is the history, and check him out for information on the shooting, which is probably what you're more interested in anyway. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon. Next time.